Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is a live stream introduction to the course that Dr. Benau is going to be doing with us starting on May 19th, I believe is the date of the first session. And it's 5 different sessions. I'm going to do a short introduction of Ken, and then we're going to have a little discussion. I would like to invite everyone to please feel free to join in if you have a question, if you have a comment, anything along those lines. We're going to be talking today about shame states and relational trauma in particular. By way of introduction of Ken, Dr. Benau is a licensed clinical psychologist for over 30 years. Dr. Benau worked with children and adults in various learning and developmental differences in inpatient, outpatient, and school settings. He's taught and supervised graduate students studying clinical psychology and school-based clinical consultation, psychotherapy, and psychological testing. Dr. Benau currently, I feel like I'm saying that wrong. You say it differently, right, Dr. Benau?
Oh, it's Benau.
Benau, okay.
But don't worry, I have family members who mispronounce it. So
okay, gotcha. Dr. Benau currently enjoys working psychotherapeutically with adults living with various learning and developmental differences, including LD, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, at his private practice in San Francisco Bay Area. His special interest and expertise is in shame and pride-informed psychotherapy with survivors of relational trauma. Working from an integrative perspective, he incorporates psychodynamic, experiential, somatic approaches, amongst others. He's explored his theme in professional conferences, webinars, podcasts, and several peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Benau's well-received book, Shame, Pride, and Relational Trauma: Concepts and Psychotherapy, published by Routledge, was published in March of 2022. And it also says here that Ken loves horses, children, especially when they're silly, laughing and making others laugh, writing, plants, freestyle dancing, and singing off key. I want to talk just briefly about the book that you published last year, Ken, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The book is called Shame, Pride, and Relational Trauma. And according to the publisher's little note on it, it's a guide to recognizing the many ways that shame and pride lie at the heart of psychotherapy with survivors of relational trauma. In these pages, readers learn how to differentiate shame and pride as emotional processes and traumatic mind-body states. They discover how understanding the psychodynamic and phenomenological relationships between shame, pride, and dissociation benefit psychotherapy with relational trauma. So that's just a little blurb about that. And I wonder, Ken, if you want to say, by way of just introducing the discussion today, a little bit about what, why you were inspired to teach about shame in particular.
You and I were talking earlier about why did I become a therapist, and it relates actually to shame. So when I was 8 years old, I decided I wanted to be a psychiatrist. I had a great uncle who was a psychiatrist, but I didn't really know what that meant other than helping people. And I found myself when I was in school drawn to the kids who were, they weren't overtly mistreated. They were sort of treated as though they weren't there. And so I only literally 5 minutes ago, I thought, well, these are the people who were living with shame and who were shamed not because people overtly bullied them or abused them. They were shamed because they were neglected. They were treated as though they didn't matter, which is actually the most pernicious form of shaming. Abuse, overt shaming is corrosive, but the kind of shaming as though you're not there, I've had patients talk about walking into a room and their parent didn't even acknowledge they walked into a room, much less asked how their day was. So how did I get into my interest in shame? Well, in retrospect, because I was living with it, but I didn't always know that. For different reasons, some, direct experiences of feeling shamed or humiliated, some direct experiences of not being sort of recognized or noticed in terms of what I was actually experiencing. I'm a sensitive, empathic, and introverted person. People who internalize are more shame prone. But as an adult, I was in therapy for many years, and no one helped me become aware I was experiencing shame until like I was with someone who did. And I used to think I was sad, but I was actually feeling a kind of an adaptive form of shame where I didn't feel I was being true to myself or my values. But there was also a lot of, quote, maladaptive experiences of shame that I had, and I didn't know it. And then when I'd been a therapist for some time, up until maybe around 2000, 2005, where I realized I needed to understand trauma. I didn't understand trauma. And then as part of working with trauma, I realized there are people who are survivors of relational trauma, which is an 𝗟𝗶𝘃𝗿𝘀𝗲 concept and term. And these are people who have experienced abuse or neglect. But basically, from his perspective, they were not regulated. They did not receive someone who helped them repair the ruptures of being treated as though they're not there, or being overwhelmed or underwhelmed. And so shame is sort of intrinsic to being human to begin with. And it's particularly noteworthy in trauma, relational trauma with people. But people don't come to therapy saying, I'm feeling shame. But if you understand sort of the form it takes, how it shows up, then you realize it's around all the time. People who are sometimes anxious are anticipating being shamed and humiliated, but they don't always know it. People who are depressed sometimes are depressed because they feel worthless, but they don't always know that's rooted in shame. In fact, much psychopathology has been shown to be rooted in shame. So as a therapist, I was bumping into, and I think many people who are listening today are bumping into, a kind of shame that was like it was a trauma state. It wasn't changing. No matter how much the person was successful in the world, in their work, in their relationships, it just kept showing up. It was like deja vu all over again, where their sense of themselves, at least when they were in this state, was they had always been, they were, and they always would be, fill in the blank, worthless, disgusting, unlovable, inadequate, etc. So these experiences of shame, which is different than shame as an emotion, which is kind of comes and it goes. These states, they're like flashbacks of being, if you will. They sort of take over the whole person. And these don't change easily. And so if you're a therapist, much less a trauma therapist, of people who've experienced relational trauma, you're going to want to know what to do with this, and you often won't know because, well, I don't know about anyone at their training. I wasn't trained enough in trauma when I began, which is way back when in the 80s, but I was definitely not taught about shame. And if you think about people like Freud, and they were interested in guilt, at least what was called guilt, that shame was rarely talked about. So I don't know if that's an answer, but that's sort of a starting answer to what you're asking.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I wonder if you could just for a moment go talk a little bit about how you think of the difference between, say, complex trauma and relational trauma and developmental trauma.
Well, they're very related. If you look at the descriptors of Judith Herman's concept of complex trauma and van der Kolk's concept of developmental trauma disorder, you'll see a lot of overlap with relational trauma. And in fact, it's just an emphasis. So complex trauma looks at, it's not a single event, and it's something that occurred repeatedly and pervasively and without repair. And developmental trauma is early in development. So it's not like it's inconsistent with the definition of relational trauma. I chose relational trauma because it's explicitly talking about relationship. And when it comes to shame is basically about relationship to self, relationship to other, relationship to the experience of the other viewing the self and the self viewing the other, viewing the self. It's like what I call a dark hall of mirrors. So I chose that because relating is basic to shame and obviously in relation to trauma. In shame, we're talking about really fundamental experiences of being, of existence, and of relating, right? In and out, above and below, excluded and included, worthy, unworthy, lovable, unlovable. So these are not particular to trauma. These are basic to being human. You can't, I think, go through life without experiencing shame. Some people have defended against the experience of shame, so they may not feel it, but it's just basic to being human. So it would be, of course, basic to humans traumatizing humans. So you can't avoid it. Even though people don't show up usually and say, I want to work on shame, unless they've now read my articles or book, and then they say, I want to work with you on shame. But otherwise, before that, no one ever did.
And for folks who are working in therapy and psychotherapy and counseling, why is it so important, really, to understand about shame? And I wonder if you could kind of help us to understand the difference, that you make a distinction between shame as the emotion and shame states.
Right. Well, shame, like all emotions, if you think about little children before anyone messes with them, they have feelings, and the feelings come and go. For a while, I spent some time in Scotland, and the weather on the west coast of Scotland just changes all the time. And if you look at children's feelings, you know, they get excited, they get sad, they get angry, and they just change, right? And kids get really upset, and then they move on, right? You say, aren't you still upset? And it's like, they're looking at you like, no. So feelings have a rise and a fall, or a fall and a rise. They are acute in the sense of short-lived. And so you can, I don't know, you can commit a faux pas and feel ashamed of yourself. But if you're not a trauma survivor, that's likely the end of it. You feel it. Someone says, oh, it wasn't such a big deal. Okay, you're right. And they move on. A traumatic shame state is chronic. It's always associated with dissociation. It's like I said, it has a form where it shows up always in the same way. When you're working with a trauma survivor, you will hear them use the same words. They express the same feelings. They hold their bodies in the same way. It's like I said, it's like a flashback of being and relating. So the difference is the chronicity. The difference is its association with dissociation. And it's intransigent. I'm not saying you can't work with it. Obviously, we're here because we all believe, or want to believe, that we can. You don't really have to do a lot with someone who's experiencing the shame, what I call not good enough me shame, which is, you know, the shame that most people are aware of, right? I can't believe I said that. I feel so embarrassed. Oh, I can't, you know, that kind of thing. That's not especially hard to work with. What that person needs is a human relationship where someone is accepting or understanding or compassionate, and they move through it. But understanding and accepting and compassion alone is not going to transform a shame state. In fact, sometimes compassion paradoxically can be problematic because it involves a kind of intimacy or closeness. And if you have been traumatized in relationship, then intimacy and closeness can be associated with abuse or neglect. And so compassion can make a person who struggles with a shame state anxious and want to defend against closeness, even though if they could receive it, and at first they won't be able to, much less experience it toward themselves, there might be some genuine relief. Shame is thought of as an interrelational experience, right? It's between me and you, or me and the person who neglected me or abused me. But it very quickly becomes an experience within. So someone else might be coming toward me with kindness, with love, with acceptance, but my internal experience might be, I'm living, if you will, with a part of me who shames other parts of me. And so, you know, you sometimes hear people say, if you only knew me, right? Or you're saying this because you're my therapist, or because I pay you, or because you're supposed to be kind and you believe it. And they don't believe it. It's not like they don't believe the therapist. It just doesn't experientially whole. It doesn't have any weight or substance.
You use the term adaptive pride to talk about sort of the growth, the healing process around shame states, and also just what kind of a healthy mental approach is, you know, a mental health approach to a sense of self. Can you talk about what that, why is that so you know, why is this not focused on? Why is this not discussed as widely in the literature as what's your thinking about this?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, there's still a tendency to, in psychotherapy, to think about pathology. So pride in and of itself sounds positive to some people. Now, historically, and still in the culture, depending on where the culture you're from, pride is associated with hubris, with arrogance, with pathological narcissism. You know, pride goeth before the fall. So pride is not generally thought of as a good thing. People don't write about pride in psychotherapy. If you look for it, you'll find articles I've written, but not a lot of others. So that's some of why I think people don't talk about it. Adaptive pride, and, you know, in my sort of nomenclature ways, I kind of divide the pie. There's adaptive and maladaptive shame, and adaptive and maladaptive pride. So the adaptive form of pride as an emotion, and Nathanson does write about this in his book about shame and pride. It's about mastery. It's about accomplishment. It's about achievement. When the child first can stand and walk, you know, they feel this thing called pride, even if no one says, I'm so proud of you, or yay, that's great. Like, they accomplished something. What? They accomplished something that was meaningful to them. Just like shame is something that is meaningful to you that leaves the person feeling inadequate or defective. Pride is about accomplishment and achievement, that kind of pride. Now, there are pride states that are trauma states, and that has to do with aspects of self that are occluded or not available to experience of pride. So, or the whole being isn't having availability to pride. And they may also have no availability to a sense of worth in any way, but it may not be the same. When I was telling some of you earlier that I was an English major. So even before I was an English major, I loved language. And so you give me a word, I have to look up its word origin. So I looked up the word origin of proud. And the word origin of proud is a Latinate form, and it's spelled P-R-O-D-E-S-S-E. So P-R-O-D means for, F-O-R, and E-S-S-E means to be. So then I thought, wait a minute, that's for being. Okay, so how is for being different than the adaptive pride of achievement and accomplishment? And this is where I came up with the term pro-being pride. I have a term, not the phenomenon. So to be pro-being is to be delighted in the uniqueness of being yourself and delighted in other people being uniquely themselves with you and in relation to the world. So pro-being I see as the most powerful antidote to shame and shame states. If shame states is you either don't exist or you have ultimately no worth, no value, to be for one's being, unique being, right? Because there's only one you. There's only one way you think, you feel, you move, you experience the world. If you can take delight in a person's being themselves and their way of relating, you cannot, if the person can receive that or experience it themselves, they cannot be in a shame state at the same time. It's not possible. And while, you know, the basic form of pro-being we see at the, you know, if a child is welcomed into the world, and we know children are not always, then the parent's typical response would be like, huh. And they say they're perfect. Well, they have their imperfections, but the parent's response is what Daniel Brown, who wrote a book about attachment disorders, calls expressed delight. Well, I don't think that stops with infants or young children. My experience with patients, people I work with, is I experience delight in them being themselves. Do I experience it every moment of every session? No. Do I always give it voice? No, sometimes I do. But if you spend time with people, even when they're talking about something exquisitely painful, where they're suffering terribly, and you just listen carefully to the words they choose or the way they move their body, you experiencing something that is them uniquely being themselves. And when you can get in touch with that, that's absolutely, that brings joy. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this experience in pro-being of what's called streaming for body therapists. It's a kind of experience of a tingling sensation or movement of energy through the body. And just now, as I'm speaking about pro-being, I'm feeling it. You don't bring it on, it sort of happens. So what I think I'm doing in this moment is imagining being with the patient where I'm having that feeling of just sort of really discovering and being with what makes them uniquely themselves, and that we get to be this way together, because hopefully I'm being me. I'm not being a therapist, though I am, and they're experiencing me too. And so we have these moments sometimes, even when they're talking about great pain, where we're coming alive. If shame states are about deadening, about dissociating, about disconnecting from aliveness, pro-being pride is about enlivening, engaging. So that's sort of a longer response to adaptive pride, and something that pro-being is not an emotion. It's a state of being, just like a shame state is a state of being. But it's not pathological, obviously. It's what I would call enduring state. That's always there, but you can't always access it, or it may not be always available to the person themselves.
Thank you. You talked about how there are challenges for a lot of therapists who are working with clients that have that experience shame states. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that, what some of those challenges are. For example, the sort of harsh self-punitive beliefs that clients have, and that kind of thing, and sort of what kinds of strategies can therapists use to address these states?
Well, first of all, the people who are in this state wouldn't call it a belief. I mean, just to be able to say to a patient, which I sometimes will, that's I'm not going to say that this by itself will make this state go away. It won't. But I will name that they have a belief about themselves. That is not their experience themselves. This is just is. It's like I'm 5'9" and I have gray hair. It just is. So when you're in a shame state, it just is. It's not I have a belief. What makes it so difficult is that when you're in this state, the experience is, this is who I am. And the experience is, if you only knew me, you would know this is who I am. Not what I do, not what I feel badly about, who I am. And anyone who knows me, anyone who discovers who I really am, this is what they're going to discover. And these are not words, these are lived experiences. So if you're living in that state, and you don't know it's a state, you don't know that how you're, quote, feeling and being is not a fact, or is a belief about self, not the whole of oneself.
Okay.
If you don't know that, then that's really difficult to shift in one's experience, because if you say, but what about these wonderful qualities, the experience will be, basically, you don't really know me. Yes, I do those things. Yes, he or she likes me or loves me, but really, it's a very different experience. How do you work with it? Well, that's, that's the $50,000 question. That hopefully is something for those of you who remember that old show. That's something that, there's many, many different ways of working with shame. And one of the things I hope people who will join us will get a sense of is I work integratively. So I work from different ways of working, but I'm also very open to other people working in their way, which, back to pro-being would be their unique way of being as a person and as a therapist. So there's lots of ways at it, but one of the beginning ways toward working with shame is to name it. In my book, I say to not name shame is to do shame's bidding. Shame, the word origin of shame is from the Proto-Indo-European kem, K-E-M, and it means to cover or to hide. And so the nature of shame is to not show up and announce itself. So if you can, because a lot of times people don't know they're in a state of shame, right? They might say, I failed, but what they mean is I'm a failure. Or they might say, well, he or she can, but I can't. But they're experiencing feelings of utter inadequacy. Or she's included, but I'm not. Right. And the reason I'm not, if they could give a reason, sometimes it's just experience, it's not named, is because they have no worth. So sometimes what I do early on is I find a way to name it in the context of something the person is saying or experiencing. And some people say you shouldn't do that, or you should be very careful about doing that. I think if you're comfortable with the experience of kind of being able to identify and work with it, then to not do it is like saying, well, if someone's suicidal, I'm not going to say, it sounds like you're thinking of killing yourself. And also the value of naming shame is that it begins to at least open the possibility, if not give the person a little bit of what some people call psychological space. So then there is me, and then there is this state. And even though a lot of times I'm in the state, sometimes I can observe the state, a little bit like how people recognize at some point that's a flashback, right? So if you can have a little bit of space between your experience of yourself now and this experience of yourself in this shame state, even if you're actually experiencing them both at the same time or alternating, then you have a little, just a beginning of a way, to think about that actual experience. Anything that allows you to think and take interest without shaming, to take interest in the experience begins to shift it. As you and I, Lars, were talking earlier, Sylvan Tompkins, the affect theorist, talks about this continuum between interest and excitement. And he says basically shame puts a brake on interest and excitement. Well, shame puts a brake on pretty much every emotional experience. But to be interested, to get curious about, to wonder about, to even begin to notice that something is to begin to shift a relationship to shame, because you can't be in a state of shame and a state of interest at the same time, even though, of course, you can move between one and the other.
You talk a little bit also about how often therapists who are working with somebody who experiences shame states are triggered by the shame state. So you react by in various emotional processes of your own. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, like what that say in your own process of working, with your own issues or as a therapist, like what kinds of things have you found in that process of moving out of a shame state or helping someone else to move out of a shame state?
In my book, I have a whole chapter devoted to this, and I kind of approach it from integrating three different ways of thinking about this. One is a parts approach from Janina Fisher. She talks about fight, flight, freeze, and submit and attach. And from Nathanson's approach, which is what he calls the compass of shame, which is four things: self-attack, basically attacking self, attacking others, withdrawing, and avoiding. And then Cartman's triangle, which is sort of persecutor, victim, and rescuer. And I'm kind of putting those three together. And because basically this is really complex, because there's the interaction between the two people, the therapist and the patient, and then the interaction, the intra-reaction between the person, the patient, and him or herself, and the therapist, and him, and herself. And many of us therapists, not all of us, have our own histories of relational trauma. Some of, there's the stereotype of the wounded healer. Well, many of us are wounded healers, so we're already vulnerable to these experiences. But even if we're not, I mean, I've had people say, I already knew that, or I could do that for free. In fact, in my book, I give talk about a work with someone who after doing a great bit of work, that things started shifting. We got in a kind of enactment, not a kind of, in an enactment, where they're saying these things about me. They're telling me that I have nothing to offer them and they have something much more valuable. And I'm sensitive. And if someone tells me I'm doing something that is of no value, I don't like it. And some people just get mad, right? That's one reaction. Oh, no, really? You think I'm have nothing to offer? No, you have nothing to. Why? You're the patient. Why do you think you're here? So that would be a reaction. Another way for me would be to freeze up. I can't think. I literally can't think. I don't have feelings. I'm kind of like, I don't, it's kind of like a disorganized attachment. I can't go toward them because they're humiliating me, and I can't go away because I'm the therapist that's supposed to be helping them. So I just freeze. And this is not like a chosen state. This is a state I fall into. In my book, where I talk about my work with Harold, when I froze up, he felt abandoned. He couldn't articulate it at the time. He had every reason to feel abandoned. I wasn't showing up. I wasn't communicating, or I got very intellectual. When I'm in a free state, I'm really good with words and I have great concepts and I'm not connected. So he was shaming me, not consciously. He wasn't aware of it, because he was becoming more and more aware of his dependency needs, and in his family of origin, to depend on either parent for different reasons, they would fail him. They wouldn't necessarily overtly shame him. They just wouldn't show up. So he's becoming more and more dependent and more threatened by that dependency. And he would alternate between shaming himself, right? People often say, I'm needy, right? As opposed to, I have needs. I'm a human being. I have needs. I'm needy. If you hear the word needy, they're in a state of shame. So he was alternating between shaming himself because of his dependency needs in relation to a girlfriend that he was falling in love with, and he was also feeling more and more dependent on me. So, but I could tell you that all now. In the moment, I froze. In the moment, I didn't know what to say, and I sought a lot of consultation, peers, my therapist, consultant that I hired, because I was like stuck. And the more I responded the way I did, which was kind of dissociated, I was not connected. I was blank. I was not emotional. I was not relational. The more I did that, the more he reacted. The more he reacted, the more I did that. And so this is what grips people. And so in that chapter, I described many different patterns of what I call inter-reactions as opposed to responsivity, right? So responsivity has a flexibility. You're not locked into a certain way. But in fight, flight, freeze, these are reactions. When a person's in a fight state, they always react a certain way. So there are these inter-reactions, and that's that part of what goes into what we call an enactment. But then there are intra-reactions. I was shaming myself for freezing up. I wanted to help him. I was shaming myself for failing him as a therapist. I wasn't thinking, oh, well, he's in a shame state and he's got all these, counter dependency issues. I wasn't in that. So I can tell you about that now. In that moment, I was a bad therapist. And if I'm a bad therapist, I'm not a good person, because there's certain things that are important to me. So if I'm not good at something that's important to me, I am vulnerable to feeling shame. And I was feeling shame. And he doesn't need a therapist to feel shame, or he doesn't need a therapist to be stuck in shame. And I was in a shame state until we found ways to move through it.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things I find compelling about your approach, Ken, is this sort of way that you're accountable about your own process, both how you've come, your own therapeutic process working with a therapist, and also in telling stories about the folks that you work with. I wonder, I understand this is going to be a part of the course that you're going to be doing, like referencing some of the stories that of like what it's been like working with different aspects of shame and relational trauma. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about what you think about that, how you're going to approach that. Give.
Yeah. Well, when I wrote the book, when I read books about psychotherapy, the parts that are best are the vignettes. That's where it comes alive. And I'm, pretty intellectual guy, so I like concepts and I like ways of thinking. But when you're like reading about, especially if you're reading someone like Bromberg, who writes as if, you're just sort of in the altered state with him, when you're reading about these, that's when you really kind of feel, what's going on. So that's what, and also, I've learned about shame and shame states from my own experience, for sure. But I learned it from my patients, and some of them anyone I write about in the book has given me permission to write about our work, obviously not in ways that can be identified, which is like a huge gift. It's like the opposite of shame. Here I am. And if you think, in fact, most people, when they say yes, they say, if you think this could help someone else, talk about an act of de-shaming. If you think you can offer something that could be beneficial to someone else, please do it. And in my book, as well as in what I'm going to cover, particularly on the last session, the 5th session, I have verbatim transcripts of my work with certain patients. Sometimes it's verbatim because the work they're doing is going internally, so their eyes may be closed and they're working with different experiences in relation to shame, for example, and other traumatic experiences. So for some of these people, not all by any means, I'm feverishly taking notes. So I have transcripts of what actually goes on. And what I'm going to do, particularly in that last meeting, but can be throughout our meeting together for those who show up, is going to be to document movements from shame states to adaptive pride to experiences of pro-being. And in this one person, 𝗖ście, who I've talked about, he has something that I think I call goes beyond pro-being, which is an experience of oneness with himself, with me, with other people, and with the world. It's what people call unitive consciousness. And sometimes people say, well, that can only be experienced in like psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but it's not true. And 𝗖ście has a history of being an alcoholic, so he won't take any drugs. So it's definitely not true in his case. So absolutely, I think we learn best from the work we do with patients. And I hope people who join the webinar series will bring in their experience personally and professionally, because that's where we learn. That's how we learn.
Great. I have a couple of other questions, and then I was thinking that we could open it up if folks want to, if anyone who's joined us has a question as well. The first of the two questions that I have to kind of, where I'm at, is the question about what emerging neuroscience indicates about shame. Are there any things that that you've discovered in your research, in your work, about the neuroscience parts, the neurophysiological aspect of shame states?
Well, first of all, there's way more we don't know than we do know. The 6th chapter of my book is co-written. I mean, I'm the author of it, but it's based on a conversation with Frank Corrigan, whose expertise is in neuroscience and also in shame. And so it's a session with 𝗖ście, a successful one, and he's commenting on the neuroscience as we're going through it. He's pretty remarkable that way. He can say, right here, it's this going on. But there's different aspects that we can say some things about. One is what I call sort of how shame develops. I don't mean chronologically, I mean in the moment. So the experience of shame in the moment, the first experience is shock. It's like a shock trauma, right? What'll happen is you suddenly experience something that is shaming. And unlike what other people talk about, which is shame is kind of hypoarousing, the initial response is hyperarousing. It's that freeze state that I was describing before in myself. So you'll have that rise in arousal, and then you'll have a drop. But in shame states, you'll have dysregulation, you'll have a rise and a dropping, and then all sorts of defensive responses in response to that. So that's one thing I learned just by tracking it in myself in the moment to moment. And being able to track it, you can often go back and say, because a lot of times people are not in that state all the time. So, or they may not have been in the state last session. I said, so when did it shift? So they'll tell me when it shifts, and then you can take an approach. Sensory motor is one way to do it. Sensory motor psychotherapy. You kind of go before that, and you can get to the moment before the shock. Once the shock happens, they drop into the state immediately. But if you can get to the moment before, you have more flexibility. So that's one aspect. One of the things I've learned with Frank and other people have learned as well is, you can think of the brain as having the neocortex, right? The thinking brain, the place where we have beliefs about self. And then you can think about the limbic brain, which is the fight, flight, freeze, the emotional reactivity. And then if you go deeper, which is where Frank's interest is, you go into the brainstem, and specifically is interested in the midbrain of the brainstem. So when you're working with shame states, you do need an approach. It doesn't have to be his approach or mine, but you have to have a way to work with the subcortical. You have to have a way to work what's called bottom up, or from the body up to the mind. So, what I was basically trying to say, I don't know what got lost there, is that you have to be able to work with the subcortical experience, whether it's the fight, flight, freeze, submit responses, or in the brainstem, the responses are called orienting responses. It's the very first somatic response to safe, unsafe. And then the very first defensive responses to the reactions to that before you even get to emotion. So, and some of the ways of working with shame, you really have to go to even the deepest levels. But so that's what neuroscience teaches us. It sometimes says, you have to find a way to get into these deeper levels, and it helps to have some experience working with the body. You don't necessarily have to be a body psychotherapist. I wouldn't call myself one, but I have a training in it. You have to have ways, because a lot of times these things show up. First of all, if you're in a dissociated state, you might not be feeling the body, or one part of your body may be having a reaction, the other part wouldn't. And a lot of times these things show up in ways that are really nonverbal. So the person might say, I hear your words, and that makes sense, and it has no effect on me. It's not touching me. So you have to have some way of going to those deeper levels, and the neuroscience confirms that in the sense of working at these other levels, whether it's limbic or brainstem.
That's great. Thank you. And the last
question. By the way, there's even less that we know about pride in the brain, if you will.
From a neuroscience perspective.
Yeah, there's some, but very little. A lot of speculation.
As I understand it, your sense is that there are some therapeutic modalities that are better suited for working with shame than others. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've arrived at that, and also your open-mindedness to other approaches.
There's one thing I'm dogmatic about, is not being dogmatic. And, therapy can become like religion, sadly. And so it can be something, my brand works best, or I know best, or one way of working with shame is best. And it's just not true. So I just approach things integratively because my mind just works that way. I did it when I was a literature student. I studied literature and history, politics, psychology, whatever. So my brain just sort of always is trying to pull things together. And my brain is, I guess you would say, is ecumenical, in that I don't believe there's one way. And since every human is unique, there can't be one way of working, right? If you go back to being pride, there can't be one way of working. What I would say is that since we're working with trauma, there has to be a way to work in some ways bottom up, whether it's about focusing on emotion, focusing on the moment-to-moment experience of the relationship, focusing on what's happening in the body. There has to be some way to do that, because words will not be sufficient in working with trauma, and they will not be sufficient in working with shame. And back to muting, shame mutes, shame deadens. And so there has to be a way of working in a way that begins to find ways to bring in a little bit of enlivenment, while recognizing there'll be all these forces to interrupt, dissociate, disconnect from that enlivenment. Which, another way to say this is, if people come into the training with different ways of working than mine, I'm fine with that. First of all, I have different ways of understanding and translating that to what I'm trying to describe. But I also think that's about our being ourselves. So I welcome people who come from different approaches. I've been a therapist for a long time, so I've been exposed to a lot of different things along the way. So I may even know some of what people have been trained in, but I'm very open to their coming from their way of working. If I wasn't, I wouldn't be pro-being.
That's great. Thank you. Are there any questions? Does anyone want to? You can simply speak up, and we'll see how it goes. If people are talking,
are there some questions also in the chat, Lars? I don't know. I haven't looked at them. I'm just
Kieran, have you been keeping an eye on that?
Yeah. No. Well, one just showed up. Here's a question for you. Are your approaches similar to Brené Brown's research on shame, or Brené Brown's?
Brené Brown.
Brené.
Well, you can't be talking about shame without having some similarities. But I would say no in this way. I do not believe she understands shame as a traumatic state. For those of you who have more training in her approach, you can tell me if I'm wrong. I do not think she understands dissociation. I don't think she, at least the little sense I have. And I think she might have difficulty understanding why some of her ways of working wouldn't work. Not because they're wrong, but because some people will have different ways they protect themselves from compassion, from acceptance, from basically love, from basically being experienced as worthy. And they're not able to do that for themselves. So again, limited understanding of her work, but I would say the piece that she probably doesn't bring in as much, and I assume it's because it's not her training. She's trained as I think a social worker, sociologist. So, but she may not have that experience. So that's what I would say. The relational trauma piece and the working with shame states may not be sufficient. And that's what I think I bring. That's one of the things I bring that's, let's call that an add-on to what she's doing.
Thank you. And to let you all know, this is being live streamed, and the recording, what we typically do, just to let you know, is that we then pull down the live stream and then edit it and then post it back again. So the recording for today's session will be available. It just takes about a week or so for our editor to do his magic. Paula, I don't see you anymore.
Yes, I'm right here. You got me?
Yeah, I see you. Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, good.
Hi,
Thanks. Yeah. Hi, thanks. So what I was thinking when you began talking about as the shame issues come into therapy, that people don't come in to say, I'm coming because of my shame problems, but as you detect shame emerging, and as you begin to try to surface that concept, it seems to me that one is often met with the kind of false self that's defending against the shame. I'm thinking of someone who really demonstrates their abilities in being smart or being learned or being creative or being expert, and that the shame is so hidden it's so inaccessible underneath a hard shell.
Right.
So that if you try to be compassionate, it's not very welcome.
No, it's not.
It drives the person deeper into the false self state is what I want to think about and ask about.
Right. If you try to go to the underneath, to where they're vulnerable, either they won't have any place to put it, or they'll react negatively or even sometimes hostily. That there is no technique for that, I would say. Well, I think there's actually no technique for this work at all, because there's nothing I can do to someone. People who've experienced relational trauma have been done to or not done to in ways that they would have needed. So anytime I get techniquey, it's going to be problematic. What I would say is, this is going to sound like, well, of course I'd say this, and many of us would say the same, is they first need to have a sense that I'm interested in them, right? What you're calling a false self is not necessarily false. It's an aspect of self that's disconnected from other aspects of self. If they're really smart, they're probably really smart. If they're really good at this thing, they're probably really good at this thing. And if I take genuine interest, not as a technique, not as, okay, I'm going to do this, but really I got a trick up my sleeve, I'm going to get to the underneath, then hopefully over time, and you and I know, time could be years, but hopefully over time, they will come to know experientially, not intellectually, that I am interested in them, all of them. And what'll happen eventually, and eventually could be sometimes years, it could be months, but eventually other aspects of self will show up, and sometimes not in any way that they know is showing up. I mean, when I was talking about pro-being, someone might start talking about something they're interested in, and I'm not interested in, like video games. And I say, well, tell me more about that, right? So they are showing up. They have a moment. Anytime they say, I'm interested in, then their, quote, truer self is showing up. It's not like, well, your false self, false self, false self, and then maybe after 12 years of psychotherapy, you get to have a true self showing up. It's showing up all the time. They can't help it, right? They turn a certain way. They have.
Well, I think that they need it to have enough self-respect or selfness to be with you. And then I think you're right, cultivating your interest in it is a good thing. But then they're worried about whether you buy it or whether...
Well, you have to always work, you know, whether you call it defense or I call it self-protective strategies, you have to always work with that. So you have to have a way to bring their interest to the ways in which they protect themselves from, if you will, no pun intended, from my interest. And that is not just between me and them, that's between aspects of themselves. So I want to invite them to be curious about, if you will, if you want to take a part's perspective, the part of them that must reject what I just said, that absolutely must, and that not to treat that as a problem, treat that as an aspect of self that is communicating something important that has made that necessary for them to survive, maybe currently, depending on the relationships, current, but definitely historically. So I'm going to treat them as someone who has a way of being in the world that is allowing them to not be hurt, again, whether it's hurt through abuse or neglect or whatever. And so I'm going to take interest in that. And if you take interest in that, you're taking interest in more of them, right? Then you're not just dealing with their false self, you're dealing with the ways they're protecting themselves. And then you're dealing with the other parts of themselves that are hidden behind the protective self. And you're opening a space for them to look at that. And, you know, that's easier said than done. And like I said, it's not necessarily a quick thing. I've had people I've worked with who would be called narcissistic, and I've worked with them for years, a lot of times thinking I'm not getting anywhere. And then after several years, they start showing up in a different way. And not because I say we're going to get to the underneath. Actually, all the times I tried to get to underneath, they would thwart it. But just because they started experiencing me as someone who's actually welcoming of them being, including the ways they're protecting themselves and falseness. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I could challenge you a little bit, Ken. Would you tell us, you know, of the courses that somebody might be interested in taking online? What is it about this course that happens in May that really makes it stand out? What's so special about this course that you're doing?
Well, me, I'm special.
Your pride.
No, what makes it special is a more direct distinction between shame as emotion and shame as a shame state. What makes it special is I'm going to talk explicitly about dissociation. We didn't say much about that today, but I'm going to talk explicitly about shame and dissociation because they actually work together to deaden and help a person disconnect and protect themselves. So that's going to be talked about. That's often not talked about. I'm going to be talking more explicitly about the shame state dynamics. A lot of times we talk about shame, but we don't talk about how hard it is to do this work. I'm going to talk about pro-being. No one talks about that, not just because it's a term. They just it tends not to be something that's brought into conversation about this work, how you access and celebrate aliveness, even when the person is suffering. That's definitely different. And the pieces about, and not just randomly, I'm going to show you transcripts so you have a real feel for that. And the neuroscience is something that people are often interested in, but often in this regard anyway, there's not a lot that's been talked about. So that's why I hope folks will show up. And I hope they'll show up because I like to engage with people, and I love to teach and I love to consult. And the reason is because people come with what they're struggling with, and then we look at it together and come up hopefully with something that neither of us would have known 5 minutes before we bumped into it. So that's another reason.
Yeah. So for a little bit of context, Ken reached out to us to do this course, and when he talks about the engagement with people, my experience of you, Dr. Benau, over the years has been you asking really cogent, salient questions in other webinars with other. So it's really interesting. I'm embracing this approach where you now are doing the presenting, stepping up to talk about an area that you're passionate about, and inviting other people to engage in the same kind of way and participate. So I hope folks have found this past hour to be useful and inspiring, and also that if you are not signed up to take the course, I think Kieran is going to post it if he hasn't yet, the registration for the course in the chat. Any last thoughts, Dr. Benau?
Well, one is I know when I haven't had my question answered that I'm like, I don't like it. So if there's some questions, I see some things in the chat, I don't know what they're saying. If there's some questions that you still have that you would like to engage with a little bit, you can email me. I tend not to use that communication professionally, but I'm happy to sort of respond some. So that's one thing I can say. Yeah, you can tell this stuff excites me. I mean, it's sort of a funny thing to be excited about. Like, I'm excited about shame, right? But I am. And I hope together we can be excited and not be afraid of looking at this, and that we can learn together. So I guess those would be my final words.
Yeah, great. And the other thing is that Dr. Benau is in New Zealand at the moment, so he joined us beginning at 3 a.m. So
No, you and I met at 4 a.m. and we started here at 5 a.m.
Gotcha.
So,
right. So hopefully
I'm starting with weight. So
very good. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.